here we are, Andy Beale, consultant, Adam Marshall, Grass Valley Chief Product Officer, and Kevin McCue, Director of Group Production Platforms at Sky. What better way to start a session than to ditch the session title? Cloud production, we're going to broaden that up and talk about software-based production and consider the cloud just a place where we put those applications. And secondly, get it in the mixer. That's the title, but that suggests that software-defined or software-based live production is still like a classic OB, a set of functional blocks glued together to fit a production need, and then tools from various suppliers, not a single one. Is that the way forward, or should it be an all-in-one, say, production tool that does it all? Let's start with Andy.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. My view has always been that single supply chain is unhealthy for lots of reasons, not just because of technology integration, but for the wider economic health of an industry and business risk. So I think an interoperable workflow, whether that was back in the days with interoperating SDI and analog and AS audio into 2110 and now into software-defined production, I think we need a healthy ecosystem where different vendors can compete and play and bring solutions that can interop. There will always be vendors who have an advantage at somewhere in that ecosystem, and you want to be able to take advantage as users of that technology as early as possible and deploy that to do the best result for your customers, whether that's your B2B or B2C customer. And I think it's even more relevant now in the software-defined space than maybe the hardware, because we're no longer talking about very long annotated 5-year plus CapEx cycles. We're talking about really agile systems that can evolve really quickly. And if we're going to reach some of the aims that we're talking about in the previous panel and look forward, creatively and really keep changing things creatively and do better storytelling and bring new exciting ways to life, particularly with the younger audiences that we were talking about needing to attract and generate revenue from this morning, we need to be that quickly. So for me, having an interoperable ecosystem where we can mix and match supplies in a sustainable way is really important.
So Kevin, for you, it's about having the absolute freedom to choose whatever tool is best suited for what you want to achieve?
Yeah, I think within certain boundaries, right? Because we are, I would say we're still in the infancy of this big transition from like traditional kind of FPGA-based kind of monolithic technology through to where we are now with software, right? So I completely agree with Andy in the sense that freedom of choice is important. I think having been able to hold vendors to account is really important as well. And actually, when you do have this freedom to move, then your vendors generally stay a little bit more focused and they stay a little bit more honest. Now, what that can't introduce, coming back to that kind of point that we're in the infancy, is kind of inconsistency. So when we start to like slam loads of vendors together without a good set of standards or a good platform to integrate the vendors on, you start to introduce risk. And when you introduce risk, you very quickly start to lose your transformation because your operational folks will start to back off, right? So, project forward 5-10 years, then I think we will be living in this world where we're in like an Apple-like app marketplace at the moment. We aspire towards that, but at the same time, we run with caution and we run with predictability.
So Adam is the man who wants to solve it all with AMP, but is AMP about being really getting every vendor in, or do you see your competitors also starting platforms where your Grass Valley applications, for instance?
Well, I think, first of all, best of breed is definitely critical, right? It's always been the bloodline for the industry. You need that competition between vendors to kind of accelerate things. If you had one vendor doing everything and they were always the best, then you wouldn't have any kind of push for that vendor to go harder. I mean, for us, that's the ecosystem approach, right? So having vendors or multiple vendors from different categories, including competitors in one ecosystem, is really what our direction is with AMP, but also allowing the systems to be external. So the interop with SDI, 21, SRT, whatever it may be, those plumbing formats are still there to have a joined-up ecosystem with other systems if you wanted it to be. But I think the key thing is we shouldn't have mixed best of breed with assuming that makes life easy, because the plumbing and the integrations are the hardest part of making all this work. In the SDI world, in the 2110 world, actually 2110 is pretty tricky at times, but in the SDI world, that was relatively easy, right? But you still had the automation challenges. When you start to bring in an ecosystem approach, like Kevin's talking about, the integration kind of comes as standard, because all those vendors have partnered and agreed on those SDKs, those standards, whatever that may be, but you can still pick and choose the graphics provider you want, the switcher provider you want, and so on.
And do you see the platform then something like you are the system integrator, and as a user, I later on just choose whatever I like and it will be glued together automatically? Or do you still see you coming in, or either somebody at the user side, to actually make sure that it all works together in configuration?
It should be either, right? So there are so the way we go to market typically is that we talk to the customer, depending on their level of skill sets, we might bring in a service provider or an SI. Maybe the customer, like Kevin, will build systems on their own, but the reality is that every customer is different from that perspective. Their maturity is different. And we have to expect that when we try to push new parts of the product that are bleeding edge, GV are always going to be involved in that. But we're building the system in a way that can be customer delivered if they choose to.
Kevin, when we had a talk before this session, you said it's not about recreating traditional workflows. So when it was get it in the mixer, get it in the audio mixer, what's different now that you're using software-based tools?
I think what, coming back to that concept of monolithic technology where you had like a box to do a job, right? What that did was it in many ways, it shaped a workflow that you committed to, and then you essentially bent your productions around that workflow, right? If you think about what happens in a video chain, some light is captured, it runs through a network, it lands into something that shapes it into something else, and then it comes out of that process and it goes off to someone to look at, right? When you think about that from a software perspective, you need to not constrain yourself with the idea that certain things do only one job. So all we're really doing is we're taking pictures and we're compositing them, and then we're creating an outcome. And if you look at things linearly, if you try and recreate traditional production environments, or you try and recreate traditional modes of operation, you're immediately limiting yourself. You may as well just not bother trying to do that in software, because you're missing the point of that kind of capability. Like tailored feeds, like multiple outputs, personalized outputs, different shapes, different patterns, different viewpoints for different viewers can be achieved in software in a way that you could never do in hardware. So that's where your focus needs to be. The idea of traditional buttons is good, and still, in my mind, still very valid. You know, I see a lot of operators kind of jamming their fingers into touch screens and then wondering why they've got a sore hand at the end of the day. And you're like, well, we spent 20 years developing a really nice button to do that, and now, because we're in software, we're just going to turn our back on that. I don't think we need to look at it like that, right? We're performing a function by creating an action, and that might be a human that creates the action, or it might be an automation, or it might be some other thing, right? But we shouldn't constrain ourselves to just this linear traditional flow of video, because we just don't need to.
So it means that if we still have hardware panels, they shouldn't exactly look like your traditional vision mixer. They can be whatever panel best fits your workflow.
Absolutely. But what I'm really keen on is that we don't create a kind of generation of little T-Rexes that have been in front of touchscreens for like just jump back to thinking, oh, this is TV now, and all of a sudden we create this whole problem. Like, if you want a traditional mechanical button, have a traditional mechanical button. If you don't want it, don't have it. If you want to talk to it, talk to it. But I feel that there seems to be a lot of focusing in our industry at the moment that we're trying to turn our back on traditional technology so much that we'll almost do that, at the expense of things that actually work. So it's about picture and outcome, right? So that's where software should be completely transparent in that process.
It's about UI. Ultimately, you can't do your job of telling the right story, working as a team, collaborating, getting the outcome if you can't talk to each other clearly, if you can't feel your way on the interfaces you're touching and see the pictures you need to see. Ultimately, that can't change. It's always been a critical thing. But you're absolutely right. It's the ability to now do multiple things in the background, or have multiple outcomes or different outcomes that's interesting and exciting. And that's a classic mistake. And also, there are interesting ergonomic challenges with touchscreens and neck position and angle of view, and this list goes on. So I think there's space for lots of different things, but it's about the right use case. And that might be the length of time you're operating in that environment versus the room you're in versus your home working or office working. There's lots of criteria to consider, and we shouldn't presume one thing is right for anyone or any use case.
No, exactly, and it's about how you put the different functions together to create the outcome. Like if you're doing a mid-tier football match where you've got one replay op, let's say, then for sure use some kind of technology that's going to give you a bunch more replay angles, right? That's good. It's giving more to the customer. If you've got a high-tier football match and you've got a load of replay ops, you probably don't need it at that point. But it shouldn't be like, I only use one type of technology for one thing. We should be able to shape and form, coming back to your question, shape and form the things that we have to produce the outcome.
The title of this session was Cloud. Is the cloud the right place to actually put those tools? I heard from you, Kevin, that you say the capacity might be an issue, and they're charging me more in the weekends because there's more need for capacity on instances in the cloud. So is it the right place, or?
Well, I don't think I said that, because I'll have my AWS account manager right on my back if that comes out. But look, I think we talked about this earlier before the panel. I think it's concurrency and volume. So, and also, where are your video signals? Let's not get ourselves caught in this mess that it has to be cloud, or it has to be on-prem, or it has to be hybrid, or it has to be 3 different clouds. Again, we're kind of missing the point, right? Where's the video coming from? And is that input source stable? Can I guarantee that the video is coming in through a mechanism where I'm not going to lose it? And then gravitate your workflow towards where that video source is. Where's the distribution source? Gravitate your workflow towards where that distribution source is. Don't get caught up in saying it must be cloud, or it must be software, it must be hardware. It's pointless. But do consider that if, for example, if you're in the long tail of sports rights, which are becoming really popular now, that maybe you don't want to have to invest millions of pounds in on-prem hardware to be able to produce high concurrency sports. Like, you don't want machine rooms full of equipment that get used 10% of their life. And that's great in software, right? And that's great that's where the cloud comes in. But equally, if you have workloads that are running 24/7, you're going to have to ask yourself, like, from a total cost of ownership perspective, where the best place to put that workload is.
Ultimately, it's not about cloud, is it? It's about flexibility and the software that allows for that. But hardware or software connected, right? The key thing is not to have a solution that only works in one. It's got to be hybrid. And most customers who are doing this today, particularly on the GV side, are doing it as hybrid. They've got ground compute doing capture or handoff, maybe even processing at the edge in the stadium or in the truck or the central facility. And then they may be using cloud to just do pop-up or scalable compute, essentially. But you pick and choose and architect it based on what your needs are for every individual production show. You don't have to do as we've done in the past, which is you build a system, spend millions on the worst case scenario. For that one time you run 6 games on the same day, or whatever the numbers may be. Instead, you build it for what you need that day and scale it to wherever you need it, when you need it, based on where those signals are coming from. So just because the signals have always gone into your facility, for some shows, it may make sense, actually, they're compressed anyway, or they're JPEG XS or whatever flavor they are, send them to a cloud instance. They don't have to go through your facility like they always have done. Think about it differently, take new approaches, and that also allows you to look at the operational side, as you say, kind of rethink what that switcher surface looks like, rethink what that operator position looks like. Most operators now are multi-skilled operators rather than I'm just doing this one function. So think about one-man show productions and these kind of things. These are the themes that seem to be coming through where broadcasters and media organizations are trying to lower their costs of operation, but also be flexible with all the things we've been hearing about today in terms of how can I be agile, how can I be flexible to create this new engaging content, not just for my top-tier productions, but also my personalized feeds, even the lower tiers or the local personalized content for that game that's around the corner in the next town. How can we do that? And we can't do that in the traditional way of hardware these days.
Okay, so
it comes to the use case, doesn't it? Because, sorry, I'm really sorry. The point being, we were doing, when I was at BT Sport, we were doing Champions League. Champions League's amazing. We were having to scale our architecture around 6 match days in the autumn, all of our channel count and everything to account for those peaks, and having all that hardware investment and amortization over that long period of time. And this is the beauty. You can scale and choose the right solution at the right point for each of your use cases. So a bit of on-prem versus a bit of agile cloud may have been a better solution if the software tools are available. But I also think it's about the user. And we might come on to this because I know we talked about it briefly in our chat and views about the skill sets required, and maybe I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. But For some people who are maybe operating not in enterprise scale, who won't have the luxury of on-prem large data sets and huge skill sets and resource, actually the ability to spin up pretty quickly and agilely a small set of infrastructure and gain access to what are now really top quality production tool sets at a SaaS model price point means that either leagues or facilities companies or production companies or startups can play now with kit and technology in a way that was never accessible.
So you're saying it's becoming a commodity?
It's a sort of democratization of access to some of these really nice tool sets, which I think is super relevant for the growth sports that we talk a lot about at these events, who are looking for opportunities to break through and provide coverage and oxygen for their product.
But it's not.
So if you were doing software-based production, how would you then cover redundancy? Because software has a hiccup sometimes. Do you put an OB just beside it, just in case everything drops, or how do you cover redundancy with those tools?
I mean, I'll have a step from my side if you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, we keep saying hardware. Hardware is still software. It's just proprietary, hosted, right? And I think what's really offered with the latest generation software is we can build new levels of resilience that you can't do in those traditional forms. Could I have 2 K-frames for every single production that I need to do a switch in? I probably couldn't justify the cost. Could I run 2 software versions just for the hours of that production and have one panel that's controlling both of them in a multi-region scenario or a multi-data center or cloud and ground at the same time? Probably yes. So it's just different takes on that same approach from my perspective.
Okay. A bit about sustainability. I think, Andy, you prepared a few slides on how it is impacting, because a lot of people say cloud or software-based is a driver for sustainable. Is it greenwashing, or is it really something that you can show, like in figures, this is really having an impact?
And look, this isn't just a cloud thing. This is a lot of remote production inference as well. I haven't got the clicker, I'm afraid, Rux, so if you could jump on. But I was going to talk about an example we had, some programming around the UEFA Youth League. We worked very closely with our friends at UEFA, Eric's in the room, looking at how we reimagine Youth League coverage, which is a really simple, relatively speaking, in the scheme of football, 6-camera outside broadcast. And if you could jump onto the next slide, that'd be brilliant. Where we have still had traditionally turning up really quite heavy infrastructure and lifting. And this was growing on some work we did with Kevin and BBC and stuff at an IBC Accelerator, looking at the opportunity around cloud production and asking the question, does cloud answer those bold claims that we know the 3 big cloud providers were making about sustainable production? And we learned from that experiment that the gallery side of the infrastructure was running at about 70% efficiency together. So we sort of took those learnings and went, what's the impact if we then make a difference on site? And so this is a classic photograph. You've got a traditional scanner, you've got a tender, you've got a generator, you've got an uplink vehicle. And if you jump on one more slide, please, you'll see that there's about 30 people required to make a really quite straightforward 6-camera production. So there's a lot of heavy lifting and equipment going there. You've got a lot of people driving to site. So we reimagined it and looked in with some of the partners that we've been involved with in the accelerator, looked at if we used some cloud production tools, came away from single feed production on site with satellite contribution to maybe some cellular bonded stuff. Latency wasn't a huge problem as long as the signals were synchronous and we could do shading and cutting and things. And so we jumped forward to a new model as an experiment, which has now become the standard workflow. And if you give me the next slide, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Where we took that heavy lifting, and this was the infrastructure. We still had to have a van to take cameras and lenses and grip. But fundamentally, there's battery-powered encoders connected back to those base stations, and this is all the infrastructure that was then required. And if you would jump onto my last slide, you'll see this changes from being 30 people for the multilateral plus 5 in our Stratford gallery making our unilateral add-on to only about 15 in total doing the whole production. And so the change there in carbon across the whole footprint is really quite significant. We think another 70 to 80%. Now, we could have done this with traditional remote production. We could have brought those bonded signals back into a gallery. So this is not an exclusively cloud gain, but certainly when you start to put these technologies together, the opportunities are seriously significant.
And is it covering the social and governance part of sustainability by having less people, or?
Well, people could be much more efficient. So we had teams who were in the morning or the afternoon doing a youth league. And this is not about cost saving, by the way. It was never about cost saving or people saving, really. But it's really about getting more efficiency. We have people who are in for a game that's maybe kicking off at 2 o'clock and done by 4, who can now be still around in the evening to help do logging or working on a second production. It was a great training ground for staff who they couldn't have gone and done this on the road because they were needed in the evening, so we could bring our junior staff through and train on this kind of product. So it's great for an ESG perspective, wider than just sustainability, I think.
Do you see, thanks to this, other people from different backgrounds or different trainings coming into Sky to do sports production thanks to software-based production tools?
I wouldn't necessarily correlate the two things together. I think Sky has its own mechanisms for bringing through the next generation of talent that don't have a kind of direct attachment to software-based production. I think what software-based production allows us to do is to offer more to content where traditionally, if we were constrained by hardware, we wouldn't have been able to offer more to. So what we used to do with our red button content, we can do a lot more to now, right? We can offer better graphics packages on it. We can offer a better overall experience because we're not constrained by, that idea that we've got a bunch of hardware sitting waiting for a peak concurrency that happens once a week. So, I wouldn't necessarily correlate those two things together, but what it does do is it gives us more scope to make more content, so therefore it gives more space for the next generation of talent to come through.
It's not like you see the next generation being more excited coming back into the media industry because it's now with different tools and it's not a sort of traveling around with OB trucks sort of work.
Not that I've witnessed from an engineering point, no.
I mean, there are gains in some things. For example, accessibility is the obvious candidate, right? OB compounds, car parks are inhospitable places if you're not privileged to be able-bodied like we are. And so working in a very accessible studio infrastructure and gallery at Osterley or Stratford or wherever it may be clearly opens up opportunities to some people that would have had them physically not available to them, and that is a fact. So I think there are some nice gains in that respect.
Is software-based production having an impact on the content, hopefully in a positive way for the people watching games? Do they get better? Do they get different? Is it bringing something also on the content side?
I think that Kevin touched on it earlier, and the stories that I've seen which are really compelling here is the ability to address multi-market in a much more efficient and targeted way because of the software-defined nature of the tool set is really interesting. If you look at, so there's a project a couple of years ago by a team in the UK working with the FA called Lion's Den, but they wanted to have multi-resolution, multi-output, multi-platform formats, all in real time, driven from the same studio and the same talent. It's still talent-led, but they wanted to have genuine native 16:9, 9:16, square, all the graphics formatted correctly for that platform, relevant hashtags and handles, all tied in. So the ability to do that at a really attractive and effective cost price from a single production is now definitely possible because of these software tools, which wasn't ever going to be possible in the old way.
Yeah, we're seeing the same with Rugby League, where we can offer like a bunch of services that would have been traditionally kind of tied to the OB vehicle. So things like VAR or concussion cam and all of that kind of that analysis, we build in software, we build that in cloud, we operate that from a regional kind of operations center. We contribute via cellular bonded to make that whole platform work, and it's just made the whole of that process of VAR and concussion just so much easier. But what that does mean is like we can reuse those signals, right? So we've got 8 signals coming from a match to do a function. I can peel those off and I could start doing cuts of that if I wanted to. I could start to do highlights, replays, all of the things that become available because I've landed the signal in one spot to do one job, and now I can reuse it to do a bunch of other jobs.
Okay. If we look at the adoption of software-based tools or cloud production, my personal impression was the adoption is still going relatively slow, but do you share that opinion, or are you seeing really now that it's booming and it's becoming mainstream everywhere?
We're seeing it massively increase in scale, and just as an acceleration of adoption. I think what's missing is the public story about it, because for many of them, for many of the customers using the solutions, it's about, okay, we're really honing and focusing our story around this, rather than talking publicly about how we're using it, for different reasons, for different customers. But the adoption is definitely there, both from a tier 1 level, but also tier 2, tier 3, and also the local leagues as well.
And is it the speed, is it related to geography, countries, or?
To an extent, yes. I think if you look at from the outcome of COVID, definitely those who had access to more cloud compute or were more kind of cloud-focused in their training methodologies as companies, they were the early adopters. It started with just remote connectivity. It then started to production in the cloud rather than having to go in and physically build systems out. Then it started to become more kind of hybrid. I think now the steer is it cloud, is it ground? That kind of goes away. It's a hybrid story. It's what it is. It's just software, right? Certainly the Western market seems to have a stronger adoption of it. But I don't think there's any particular reason for that apart from where the hyperscalers are. The hyperscalers tend to be pushing the agenda there. And at the end of the day, if you're in an area with less connectivity, and so you're not going to be having people work remotely, you're probably not going to be pushing the envelope for this because you've got a system that works. So it's where you get the efficiencies for remote connectivity or the agility of creating new publishing endpoints, new regionalized content, those kind of things. That's where the drive for software processing is today. It's about creating more value out of your assets.
And it's not related to the size of a leak, like?
Not as far as we've seen.
So you could say, if you're a small league and you can only do something with 8 cameras on a regular game, you can also do 16, 20 cameras.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing stopping you from doing it. There are, if we look at what the differences between hardware and software are in terms of performance, there are differences, right? So we're constrained to some level on what you can do in software versus on an FPGA based on I/O density. Although some of the things that GV are doing around grid and kind of onboarding with XIPIO, those kind of things, they kind of compensate for that and create those same capabilities with scalable compute. But the reality is that FPGA can still do a lot more in a dense fashion than software can from an I/O capacity. But that's why we're offering both. I mean, from a GV perspective, it isn't a decision of do you want hardware or do you want software. It's which way do you want to go today, and giving you the tools to expand it out as a connected solution. And that's why you've still got the switches, you've still got the cameras, you've still got the routers, and then you've got the software layer as an option to go alongside or instead of. It's up to the customer really to pick and choose which way they need to go.
Okay, it was already mentioned by Serge, I think, in his keynote. This is the Football Production Summit, not the Soccer Production Summit. Anytime soon we will see, let's say, the Super Bowl being produced with software-based tools, or?
Maybe you have.
Maybe we have already.
They can't really say much more than that. But those levels are definitely being done to a degree through these services.
So the market is ready for that?
Yeah, it's a question of, what can I say? I think the software is there and ready to perform at that scale. Well, the question is the business risk profile. That's what it comes down to. It's what's my driver to do that in the cloud or on-prem with hardware, with software, whatever it may be. Maybe you've got the solutions already in place to do that. And for some, they see benefits from a technology perspective or from a scale or a regionalized or personalized content perspective to do it. Others want to be more reserved and they're taking a slower pace, and that's absolutely fine. There's no rush to do it.
So, Kevin, if you're hosting the Champions League final, definitely software-based in the cloud.
I mean, I'd be surprised if we were, but look, I think use the right tools where they belong at the moment. I think a Champions League final or a massive Premier League, there's a lot more going on than just cutting some signals together, right? And this is where you tend to have huge production environments, lots of people, lots of moving parts, lots of things going on. The value of the content is absolutely astronomical. And if you have a good solution in hardware that works for you, you don't have to change it for the sake of doing it. Now, if you wanted to create a tailored feed, taking some of those cuts, making a 916, doing another piece of content off the back of that very expensive write you've got, then absolutely, that's where you're going to inject software to allow you to do that. Again, I think there's too much kind of, it has to be one way or the other. You have to be in software, you have to be in hardware, you have to press a button or you have to talk to it or press a touchscreen. I don't prescribe to that. Put the right tool where it needs to be to get the outcome, but do realize that in software you can create lots of different outcomes that maybe you couldn't do in in hardware. What I would say about hardware, and just touching on what Adam said there, and sustainability as well, we do have to be cognizant of the fact that you can do a hell of a lot in FPGA for not a lot of power. You know, you're turning up with GPU farms to do software-based production that are thousands of watts to allow you to do that, where traditionally you could do that in hundreds of watts in FPGA. So let's not go too far one way or the other. Let's know that we can evolve. Let's know that we can put different shapes of technology together to create different outcomes, and then let's push our vendors to give us an ecosystem that allows us to do that.
I do agree with everything you've said, but I would also say every software is not the same as well. So there's, 2 years ago, we were talking about, is cloud the right way to go? The reality is that some solutions run in software, but they're basically lift and shift. So you need to make sure you go cloud native if you do go software, but hardware has its place absolutely as well.
Last word to Andy. Do you see the, let's say, easy software you were mentioning, which everybody can use to produce? Do you see them move them up to become one day sort of compatible to what's currently done on the high-end side?
So, I'm not sure I've answered the question, sorry.
You mentioned earlier that there's sort of small applications that you can use to just as a commodity to produce live.
Yep.
Do you see them move up to the level where they compete with actually the...
For sure. I mean, this has been the way for things get smaller, the bottom comes up. It's happened in hardware. Blackmagic democratized the hardware market and headed up in the northerly direction towards the established high vendors, and exactly the same will happen in software. And then someone else will come along and disrupt again. This is the continuing, exciting cycle that we live in broadcast technology, and I think it's always going to be that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam, Kevin, Andy. Warm round of applause, please.